Let's talk about Marx for a bit. I've posted a chapter called Capitalism and Marxism from that book I told you not to buy. It explains Marxism from a modern perspective. And by the time you watch this, there should also be a couple of excerpts from Marx's own writings as well. Now, I understand if sometimes you don't have time to read the readings before the lecture like I told you were supposed to. That's okay. The readings serve a number of purposes. For example, you can use them as resources for your upcoming argumentative essay, if that's something that you want to do. Another reason is that I don't want these lectures to be, well, me just saying stuff. I can't actually do citations in the middle of the lecture, so the readings are kind of like me showing my work, telling you where my information comes from, so that you can confirm it for yourself, and also how to find out more if you're interested in the topics. Just good habits for academic just good habits for academic writing that I'm trying to incorporate into my spoken out loud talky things as well. I feel like every time I mention Marx, the anxiety level in the room goes up a notch. So let's deal with that first. There's a mythology about Marx that's been built up over decades of anti-Soviet propaganda. Most of you have probably already heard this story, but just in case, uh, Russia, which was back then called the Soviet Union or the USSR, was America's main geopolitical enemy. This would have been true regardless of whether Russia embraced communism or kept the Tsar. We know this. We know this is true. They would have been enemies anyway, because Russia is still the US's main geopolitical enemy, and they stopped even claiming to be communist over 30 years ago, which makes it a bit troubling that the current president of the United States appears to be working for Russia, but that's another story. My point is that when people hear the word communism or Marx or Marxism, they usually think of the Soviet Union or modern day China, even though in reality those countries were and are about as far from what Marx called communism as you can get. I told you this was because of propaganda, but it wasn't just anti-Soviet propaganda. It was also propaganda coming out of the Soviet Union. Russia and China said they were communist. They claimed to be communist and spent quite a lot of money crafting an image of themselves as a worker's paradise. I may have mentioned something called Marxist-Leninism earlier, or possibly Marxism-Leninism. It doesn't matter if I get the name right because it's not a real thing. It's not a coherent political philosophy. There are no texts explaining it. It's just a way to slap the word Marxism onto whatever policies and ideas the people in charge of the Soviet Union were pushing at the time. I guess they called it Marxist-Leninism so that they could deviate from Marx as much as they wanted, but still call it a form of Marxism, I guess. Anyway, whether you want to call it state capitalism or fascism with a worker-friendly coat of paint, it doesn't matter. We don't have to get into it. Just remember that it was absolutely unlike what Marx would have called communism. We're going to talk about Marx. Put out of your mind all associations with Soviet Union or so-called communist China. So if communism isn't what you've been told it is for your whole life, what is it then? Well, I'm supposed to be spending a big chunk of this lecture unpacking that, but just so that you have somewhere to like hang the word, the central concept of communism is that The workers control the means of production. If the workers don't control the means of production, it's not communism. What does that mean? Workers control the means of production? I know it's like a slogan you could stick on a bumper sticker, but here's a real life example. There's a form of business called a co-op. Okay. This is a real thing. There's lots of co-ops and lots of different companies. And what makes this a co-op, which is probably short for cooperative. Anyway, what makes it what it is, and I'm just going to call it and I'm just going to call it a co-op, is that the workers own the business. The workers own the means of production. I'm trying to explain that concept. I don't know if Marx talked about worker-owned co-ops. Doesn't matter. I'm just trying to explain that one expression. So in a co-op, the workers are a bit like shareholders. Every employee of the business has a share, and everybody has an equal share. And nobody else like owns any part of the business. So it is owned entirely by the workers, and everybody has an equal share. Got it? This means that if the business makes a profit, this profit is spread equally among all of the employees. Isn't that nice? However, one of the cool things about a co-op is that the business doesn't have to make a profit because the employees also all draw a salary. This means that they may decide collectively, because all the decisions are made democratically by the employees. Communism, the connection between communism and democracy, eh, Marx would say that communism is like an extension of democracy, actually. He would say that communism is the full realization of democracy, but we don't have to get into that. Um, a co-op is definitely run democratically. So, um, the uh, the workers who control the co-op may decide to forego making a profit and instead give every employee free childcare with the money that could otherwise have been a profit. This would be more efficient than if every worker had to get their own childcare, because the company as a whole can negotiate a better price for childcare than if each employee had to do it on their own. Same principle applies to unions, but I don't want to get into a big digression on unions. My point is, this is an example of communism in action. It actually has nothing to do with everybody having to wear the same clothes or the suppression of free speech or anything like that. Okay, sorry about the preamble, but I think it was necessary. Now let's talk about what Marky Marx actually said. People seem to think that Marx was some kind of revolutionary. In fact, he was a 19th century German philosopher. He spent his life uh, traveling, writing, teaching. He was a professor. He had my job. Marx was a very sensitive man who was deeply moved by the suffering he saw around him in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. He also apparently watched Star Trek, but we'll get to that later. My point is that most of Marx's writings are descriptive rather than prescriptive. Do you remember that distinction? We talked about it in the first term. It has to do with how some of our statements are about how things are, and some of them are about how things should be and how those operate differently. Marx is best known for two of his writings: the Communist Manifesto, which is a pamphlet that he co-authored with another dude named Friedrich Engels, and also Capital, a three-volume series of books that you've probably heard of under the name of Das Kapital. Normally in English, we refer to the name of books by an English translation of their name, but we know this work by Marx mostly under its German name. Why? Well, it's because of that decades-long campaign of propaganda that I mentioned earlier. The idea is to use the German name to make it sound foreign, basically, alien, and therefore bad. That's not even how it's pronounced. Das Kapital. German pronunciation works the same as English pronunciation if English pronunciation made sense. In English, we get this thing about not pronouncing the E's at the end of words from French. In French, none of the last letters of words are pronounced, except sometimes at the beginning of the next word. Ridiculous. So in the book that I'm now going to call Capital, Marx was not arguing that we needed to overthrow capitalism through a communist revolution. Not at all. What he was doing was describing the world that he lived in terms of systems and forces rather than the choices of individuals. This was kind of new. It would only be a bit of an exaggeration to say that the science of sociology started with Marx. Not that Marx was the first philosopher to think systemically. In fact, his work was an adaptation of the work of an earlier German philosopher named Hegel. But don't worry about Hegel, we're talking about Marx. My point is that Marxism isn't an ideology, it's a mode of analysis. And by that I mean it's a way of thinking about the world. Specifically, it's a way of thinking about the world on a large scale, at a certain level of abstraction that allows us to understand it, specifically in terms of how it got the way it is and where it's going. Marx saw capitalism as the dominant system that dictated the way society worked in his day, also ours. In fact, if you read Marx, this is kind of cool, actually. If you read Marx, his writings sound a lot more like he's describing today's society than the world that he lived in the first half of the 19th century. Remember how I said that liberalism is not a particular political position, but a set of assumptions and categories that seem self-evidently true to most of us living in the world today, at least in the part of the world that we call the West? Marxism is like that. Many of his ideas, such as a social class, working class, middle class, upper class, although we don't usually say upper class anymore. Many of his ideas have become part of the unquestioned background of our thought. Do you think that the working class is a real thing? Congratulations, you're a Marxist. So Marx didn't argue, or at least he didn't argue this in Capital, that the proletariat should overthrow capitalism and create fully automated gay space luxury communism. Instead, he predicted it as something that would happen. Okay? Descriptive, not prescriptive. Some of you may be familiar with Isaac Asimov's Foundation series of science fiction stories. I believe there was an Amazon show a couple of years ago. I haven't seen it. I read the books. Sorry, I'm like that. So anyway, in Foundation, which is a series of science fiction stories by science fiction author Isaac Asimov, it takes place in the outer space future. And in it, a scientist named Harry Seldon developed a mode of analysis that he called psychohistory, which enabled him to predict the future, but only on a large scale. Basically, he could predict how society would behave, but not individuals. In Foundation, in the story, at that point, humanity had spread across the stars and created a galaxy-spanning empire. Hari Seldon predicted that this empire would fall, and he took action to minimize the damage that this fall would do. However, he did get into trouble because people confused his predicting that the empire would fall with him wanting to make it fall. Anyway, I hope you're getting the connection here. I've never read anywhere that Asimov Asimov's Foundation series was inspired by Marx, but it's very hard to believe that it wasn't, because Seldon was doing basically the same thing that Marx was. As a friend of mine said, Asimov probably didn't read Marx, and so he probably got the ideas through osmosis. But that's kind of my point. You don't have to actually read Marx to get his ideas. In very broad strokes, his ideas have become part of the framework in which we think, just like liberalism. That said, although they have certain things in common, liberalism and Marxism are broadly contradictory modes of thought. That is, they disagree on certain important things. Liberalism is all about individuals making free choices, like in the social contract. Marxism, on the other hand, is all about impersonal, abstract, group level things like systems and forces. Marx agreed with liberalism insofar as he thought that what society should do is maximize the liberty or freedom of individuals, very unlike the Soviet Union, you notice. Actually, here's a quote. Okay, so here's a quote from his book, The German Ideology. And the purpose of this quote is to give you an idea of the future that Marx hoped, a future for humanity that Marx hoped could be brought into being through a combination of social change and technological advancement. I'll read it. For as soon as the distribution of labor comes into being, he's talking about capitalism here, okay? So the first couple sentences, capitalism, not the future. For as soon as the distribution of labor comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a cultural critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in communist society, so now he's describing the future that he hopes we will achieve someday. In communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. So the point of that quote was to illustrate how Marx wanted humans to be freed from labor so that they could pursue their interests, so that they could have fun, and so that they could become their best selves.
This is the 24th century. Material needs no longer exist.
Then what's the challenge?
The challenge, Mr. Offenhaus, is to improve yourself, to enrich yourself. Enjoy it.
So you could say that Marxism and liberalism are aligned prescriptively, but not descriptively. They sort of have the same ends. They just analyze the world in different ways. Which brings us, conveniently enough, back to the political spectrum. In this diagram, you can see that Marxism, or actually it says communism, close enough, is further left than liberalism, which is here in the center. Now, the way the political spectrum is conventionally understood, we think Marxism is further left because Marxism is more extreme, or that Marxism is like liberalism, only turned up to 11, or something like that. But it's not. The difference is not quantitative, which is why it's not a spectrum. The difference lies in what concepts and categories should you emphasize when trying to understand how society works. So let's look at those now. Marx used a mode of analysis that he called dialectical materialism. This basically means that if you want to understand how society works, you need to look at people on the group level, and you group people in terms of their material interests. So he thought that the most important grouping, the most important way that you split up people in society to understand how society works was according to class. And by class, he means social class, rich people, poor people, etc. Not like this is your modes of reasoning class. And keep in mind that the way we think about the word class, although Marx wasn't the first person to use it in that way, the concept as we think of it today, very much informed by his thought. Anyway, Marx saw that the forces of capitalism tend to organize people into two groups, which he called the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, or as cowards call it, the bourgeois. Like I said in a previous lecture, capitalism in history replaced feudalism. Under feudalism, there was a hierarchy of feudalism, all about feudalism was all about hierarchy. There were a bunch of classes arranged in a hierarchy dictated mainly by birth. There were kings, lords, knights, etc. But by Marx's time, capitalism had largely reordered society into just two classes whose identity is determined by their relationship to what Marx called the means of production. Here they are on the slide. These two groups were what he called the proletariat, or the working class, or sometimes just the workers. The proletariat or working class contains the vast majority of people, and it means people who make a living, who make their money by selling their labor or work for a salary, whether at a factory or a university, doesn't matter. In Marx's sense of the word, I'm a member of the working class because I work for a salary. The other group of people, very small minority, he called the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie, this is what defines what the bourgeoisie are. They don't work. They're not workers. They don't have to work because they make their money just by owning things. Capitalism organizes society in such a way that the interests of these two groups are fundamentally opposed. The bourgeoisie, who I'm going to henceforth refer to as the capitalists, because bourgeoisie is a French word and we don't like French in these parts, they make money through profit, which, if somehow you weren't already aware, profit is the difference between how much it costs to make a product and how much you can sell that product for. There are various costs in making a product, obviously. But in modern industrial society, by far the largest of these costs is paying workers to produce the product. This means that capitalists, which remember, is people who own businesses or have share in businesses, the investor class, if you like, therefore, they are motivated to pay their workers as little as possible. Now, I want to illustrate this by, well, I actually wasted a lot of time trying to find a short YouTube video that explained this concept with nice pictures and colors, but I couldn't for some reason. I found a bunch that brought in a bunch of other concepts, which we didn't need, and therefore would have just been confusing. And I found some that had titles like, Your Boss is Stealing from You, which seemed kind of biased, so I didn't want to use those either. That means that I just have to explain it to you myself without the images. Sorry. I might have stolen some of this from a YouTube video, though. Let's say you, yes, you, work at a pizza parlor making pizzas. You get paid $5 for each pizza you make, and your boss, by which I mean your employer, the business owner, but I'm just going to say your boss because it's easier, sells it for $10. So he pays you $5 to make a pizza. He sells it for $10. Obviously, these are made up numbers for ease of explanation, like all numbers. Since the pizza that you made is worth $10 and you only get $5, that means your boss is stealing half the value of your labor, right? Simple. Well, not so simple. There are other costs to running the pizza parlor besides your salary. There's the ingredients. There's the electricity. There's the rent on the unit if it's being rented. If it's owned instead of rented, there are a bunch of other costs. So let's say, hypothetically, that those other costs come to $4 per pizza. This means that between your salary and the other costs, your boss is only making a paltry $1 per pizza. That's not good. He's got shareholders to feed. This means that your boss will be motivated to pay you less than $5 per pizza, $4 or $3, or maybe 5 cents if he can get away with it. Now, I want to clarify that this doesn't mean that all capitalists are evil people who want to exploit you. It's possible that your boss would like to pay you $5 per pizza, which we're going to say is a fair price. But he has a competitor down the street who is selling pizzas for $7 a piece because he's paying his workers only $2 per pizza, 2 pp. This means that your boss will go out of business if he tries to pay you $5, a decent salary. It's the system that motivates him to pay you as little as possible, maybe even forces him. I mean, if he goes out of business, you're out of a job. Okay, so that was less of an oversimplification and maybe a hyper mega oversimplification, but don't worry about that. It'll do for now. What I want you to take away from this is that the Marxist mode of analysis says that if you zoom out and consider not just individuals and individual choices, but groups of people, and not just individual choices, but the accumulation of choices over long stretches of time, you will find that groups or classes of people will make decisions that serve their material interests, which under capitalism almost always comes down to money, regardless of how the individual members of the group feel, and sometimes regardless of what they want. This is what sometimes gets referred to as systemic thinking. Anyway, it means that if you want to make things better for people, you have to make changes to the system, which is usually done through legislation. So, for example, in the case of you and the pizzas, uh, the government could create a law that limits how little people can be paid. So they have to, law says they have to pay you like this much or more. They can't pay you less than that. Let's call it a bottom salary or a remuneration floor or something. Maybe you can think of a better name. If we do that, if the government does that, it means that both your boss and your competitor have to pay you a fair wage, and they can't undercut each other, so they can both stay in business while you get to earn a living wage. Everybody wins. Again, real life, more complicated than that example, but that's kind of the point of examples, which are used to illustrate points. Yeah, I feel like some of you probably know quite a bit more about economics than me and are already wincing at some of the things that I've said. Sorry about that, but a lot of other people have never thought about this stuff before. And so we have to start at the ground level. Marx argued that because of this adversarial structure, capitalist labor was inherently exploitative in a way that goes beyond our ordinary understanding of the word exploitation. So when we hear the word exploitation, maybe we think of bad working conditions, or maybe something to do with the commodification of sex. Now, that's a start. We can use those examples to lead us to the wider problem of exploitation that Marx describes. So the core of it is that capitalist labor is exploitative because it's coerced. So there's a great YouTube video that I watched a couple of months ago that asks the question, is it possible to make ethical pornography? Yes. The video was about, can you make ethical porn? The video is long and super interesting. Maybe I will put the link in the PowerPoint, but right now I just want to cite one tiny bit of it.
And I get that like a lot of their idea is like this wave of, I think it was third wave feminism, people were like, oh, sex work and like sexuality is empowering. And they want to like fight like, oh no, sex work's not empowering, it's exploitative. But do you know what kind of labor is exploitative? All of it. How are sex workers exploited? How are workers exploited? So the main thing is, how can we make sure that these people are there of their own free will and they're not being forced or coerced by various circumstances? They don't have to do this to survive. They are not being coerced, financially or otherwise, into doing these acts, this labor, that they don't want to do and wouldn't do if it weren't for that coercive environment. In the US, it's work or starve. You can't just, not work. You'll die. They will toss you on the street and you'll die. So, work or starve, bitches.
The conclusion that she draws in the video was that if we want to make ethical porn, we need to institute universal basic income or something like that. It's been a while. You should watch it. So capitalism is exploitative on top of all the other ways that it could be exploitative and is sometimes, like the working conditions in sweatshops, or the way professional workers like me are kind of quietly pressured into working much longer hours than we're actually paid for. Now, I'm not saying that people wouldn't work if they didn't have to work to live. We know this is not true. There have been several pilot studies on universal basic income which have demonstrated that people will choose to work even if they don't have to. What they won't do is work 40 hours a week at exhausting or humiliating or otherwise unpleasant jobs. And when you think about it, 40 hours a week is a lot. Like, I did some math, and there's actually a bunch of stuff that I decided to cut out of the video for time. But the idea is, if you add it up, we spend roughly one half of our waking hours over the course of our lives working at a job. Well, I'm cheating a little bit because I'm including school, public school, or university and stuff. Very similar. Going to school, you remember school? It was like very much like having a job. That's a lot. Peasants under feudalism, their lives sucked in a lot of ways that our lives don't suck now, but they got a hell of a lot more days off. And before that, before agriculture, when we were hunter-gatherers, so roughly 90% of the time that human beings have existed, we were hunter-gatherers. Estimates say they only worked about 15 to 20 hours a week, and they weren't working very hard either. This system where people have to work 40 hours a week, and yes, I know many people work more. This is the optimistic version. So people working this much is not normal. It's not inevitable. We created this system, and we didn't have to. And it hasn't been around for very long. This system, industrial capitalism, has only been around for about 200 years. It's not natural. It's not inevitable. And while plenty of people like me have good jobs, a system that forces over 90% of people to sacrifice half of their waking hours just to stay alive is not a good system. It's a combination of just of being forced to work to live with just how much of your life it takes up that makes it really upsetting when you think about it. Central point is that in addition to all of the other ways that wage labor is often exploitative, it's also always exploitative to the extent that it's coerced. Now, what's particularly insidious, but also very, very interesting, is the form of coercion employed by capitalism. It's a form of coercion that tends to hide the fact that it's coercive. If I point a gun at you and say, dig this ditch for me, or I'll shoot you, the coercion is right out there in the open. There's no denying it. But if I offer you a job digging ditches for me, you might think I'm doing you a favor. Maybe you really needed that job. The situation is basically the same, dig ditches or die, but it looks very different. I mean, it would be weird if you said, you're coercing me. From my perspective, I'm not coercing you. I can't force you to take my ditch digging job. You're not my ditch bitch. However, you do have to take some job. So it's not me that's coercing you, it's the system. And this gets at another even more insidious way that capitalism coerces us. It coerces us by bribing us. It coerces us by offering us stuff that we wouldn't otherwise have. One of the sillier defenses of capitalism that you might hear, that you often hear, is when people say, "Oh, you don't like capitalism. Well, I notice you like that computer over there. You like listening to your heavy metal, and watching your porn, you wouldn't have any of that stuff if it weren't for capitalism. Yeah. This argument is silly because it suggests that if we were to give up capitalism, we would also have to give up all of our stuff. But we don't, though. We already have the stuff. If we could somehow end capitalism today, the stuff wouldn't go away. We would still have everything that capitalism gave us. However, if we imagine an alternate history in which capitalism never happened, and I guess society stayed the way it was before capitalism, but somehow we were all still here, which definitely wouldn't have happened, but it's a thought experiment. Bear with me. If we, that alternative, and I had to choose between the way the world is now and the alternative where capitalism never happened, but I was still around, I'd probably choose this one. Lots of people nowadays get to live normal, fulfilling lives thanks to technology that we wouldn't have if it weren't for the Industrial Revolution. Maybe you thought I was going to say capitalism there. Well, capitalism and the Industrial Revolution are kind of tied up together in ways that I don't think I really have to explain, and I'm definitely not going to. You can fill in the blanks. My point is that capitalism is a kind of trap. It's given us a society full of wonders that we don't want to give up and that we kind of become dependent on, even though we weren't dependent on them before capitalism, if hypothetically we were around then. So it gives us all this stuff, but it also forces us to feed half of our lives to the capitalist machine. Thanks to the way money functions, you can get everything you want as long as you have enough money. That's great. But on the other hand, the flip side is if you don't have any money, you're screwed. You die, in fact. Capitalist modes of production are so much more efficient than the ones that preceded them that they mostly squeezed the other ways out of existence. Thanks to mass production and the factory system, ordinary people like you and me can afford cups and jackets and cell phones and all the other things that were previously made by hand. But we also can't make them by hand anymore. That world is gone. People sometimes describe capitalism as hegemonic. This means that it takes over. It squeezes everything else out. The other options die off. It also fosters the illusion that we can do without other people, that we don't need other people. The truth is, in reality, we absolutely need other people to make all the stuff, but that's easy to forget when we mostly only relate to other people through the medium of exchange. I mean money. That's why that libertarianism article I asked you to read a few weeks back was hilarious. Libertarians think all they need is money, and they see government as the enemy because the government wants them to pay taxes. Oh my God. Consequently, libertarians are typically anti-government. You remember how that guy said government is like the most dangerous thing we've ever created. Libertarians are anti-government, but without government to protect your stuff and make all of that magic paper worth something, they have nothing. They're actually completely dependent on government. The more money you have, the more dependent on government you are, which is why these people are so funny. Not only does the system foster the illusion that we don't need other people, it also kind of creates a system that's antagonistic. Like, it makes it as if other people are our enemies. I already talked about how workers and capitalists or business owners have opposing interests, but it doesn't end there. Workers also compete with other workers for jobs. Capitalists compete with other capitalists to sell stuff. As we were reminded by the pandemic a few years ago, with the supply chains breaking down and stuff, our society is more interdependent than it ever was. So many interlocking systems that if just one of them breaks down, it can grind to a halt. What this illustrates is that it's all based on cooperation, but the system of exchange, the money thing, makes the system look like it's adversarial. Actually, or maybe it makes the system actually adversarial. I might have to think about that. There's a bit in Marx's writings, where he points out that as oppressive and often inhuman feudal lords could be, there was at least the understanding, they at least had an understanding that they needed to protect the peasants that they were exploiting from bandits and raiders, give them access to the land and the time that they needed to do the work that the Lord wanted them to do. Why do I bring that up? Well, now it's not like that anymore. Now, because money kind of substitutes for everything, the well-being of their workers, capitalists can just treat that as somebody else's problem. All they have to do is pay you a wage, which is normally the lowest wage that they can get you to accept, and finding a place to live and paying your bills and getting the cat out of your face is your problem. Not only is it your problem, it's an opportunity for other capitalists to exploit you. Do you remember what Hobbes said about the state of nature? That it was a war of all against all? You might not remember, but that was what he said. Well, the war of all against all is definitely not the state of nature, but it is kind of an approximation of the world that capitalism builds.